Charles knew he couldn't fight Catherine. It wasn't just because of how important she would be in the future, but also because of what she had done for him in his past life. He had been surrounded by Leonard's forces, and Catherine had killed 100 soldiers by herself, giving him a chance to escape. She hadn't specifically tried to help him, but she had saved his life nonetheless. Though the two of them hadn't interacted much after that, Charles hadn't forgotten. He was the type of person who repaid kindness. In his previous life, he had given up the opportunity to become a paranormal because of a favor to someone else. He'd been disheartened about that and had become indifferent to doing people favors. But he couldn't act so casually about someone saving him without asking for anything in return. Catherine's followers started to clamor. What's there to investigate? They've already admitted that they killed these herders. This group of homicidal maniacs is a malignant tumor. We should kill them all. Their protest made Charles feel a little smug. The Catherine I knew never would have let idiots like these guys follow her, he thought. No wonder she only had that fox by her side when we met in my past life. All of you, shut up, Catherine shouted. Everyone was instantly silent, and there was fear in their eyes. Once it was quiet, Catherine walked over to Charles. Quentin and the others reached for their weapons, ready to make a move, but Charles stopped them with a gesture. Catherine waved her hand, and a flurry of snowflakes rose from the ground, exposing many sets of hoofprints that had been buried in the snow. There was a large group of horses moving slowly at first, she said, examining the markings carefully. But then they turned and sped up, heading for the place that became the battlefield. It seems you were right. They attacked you first and wanted to kill you, but they weren't strong enough, so they died at your hands instead. She frowned, and then she sighed softly. All right, you can go. Just from the hoofprints on the ground, she had deduced exactly how the battle had begun, and how it had ended. She had even been able to tell that after Charles's group had killed most of their enemies, the remaining herders had tried to escape, but had been unsuccessful. Before the apocalypse, the Daunians' actions would have been appalling, but in the new era, it was nothing. Her sigh was a lament for the times they lived in. Alice's mouth hung open in disbelief, as she realized Catherine had to be very intelligent to figure out so much from a bunch of hoofprints. Is she a detective? Alice whispered. Don't be too impressed, Charles said. Anyone with a brain could have figured that out. He scowled at Catherine's followers and he asked, Do you still want to kill us? What are you, some kind of assassins? Alice glared at them too, but she didn't say anything. She knew that trying to argue with Charles only led to trouble. A few people snapped back at Charles for his mocking. What do you mean, you scumbag? Yeah, that's taking it too far. Catherine glowered at her followers, and they all fell silent again. They didn't dare act rashly in front of her. Let's go, she shouted, turning to leave. Behind her, the garden of trees that trapped the Daunians turned into ice crystals and dissipated into the air. Wait, Charles called after her. What are you doing here anyway? Does this have anything to do with a special summoning to the north? Were you summoned too? Catherine turned around, but didn't seem surprised. I wasn't summoned, but some of my followers were. That's why we're here. That wasn't entirely unexpected to Charles. A person like Catherine was hard to control or influence. In his previous life, there had been no one else like her. She had often acted righteously and had saved people from the invaders more than once. Many people had said she was kind, but in the apocalypse, kindness was synonymous with weakness, so someone had plotted against her. They had held many survivors hostage and had demanded that she do what they wanted, or else they would kill the hostages. Instead, Catherine had killed more than 3,000 people in that survival base, both the kidnappers and the hostages. No one had been spared. Everyone had been appalled by her actions, and her reputation had been ruined. The military had demanded an explanation from her, and she had cooperated. Those so-called hostages and kidnappers were in cahoots, she had said. So what's wrong with killing them? The matter had never been resolved. During the invasion, Catherine had saved nearly 100,000 people. Even though she had killed many humans at the survival base, the military hadn't been able to overlook her previous heroic actions. Even though her methods had been cruel, she had still done a lot of good. Besides, her level had been too high for them to be able to handle her. But the Catherine standing in front of Charles in the snow hadn't yet reached that stage. That was obvious from the fact that she was tolerating followers that seemed to be so far beneath her. It's a trap aimed at humans, he warned her. and I'm going there to get rid of it." She stared into his eyes for a few intense moments, as if she were trying to confirm something. "Then that's all the more reason for me to go," she said. "Whatever," Charles said. Then he urged his horse and galloped away. He had warned her, but what she did with that information was up to her. He wouldn't interfere with her plans anymore. They had eliminated the herders in the northern grasslands. Without those obstacles, his group would be able to travel much faster. He knew that as long as he arrived before Catherine did, he would be able to control the situation. After Charles and the others left, a woman beside Catherine said indignantly, "I didn't expect you'd be willing to let those murderers go." "Do you know why I keep you all by my side?" Catherine asked her. "No. Why?" "Because only when you're by my side can I keep you from doing anything stupid." "How'd she do that?" Alice muttered to herself as the group continued their trek. Even with her powerful water abilities, she felt inferior after seeing the intricate garden of ice Catherine had created. She wondered if Catherine was even human. The others all looked at Charles, wanting to know if he could explain the special ability that she had used so effortlessly, and that had left them all in shock. "You all think too highly of me and don't give others enough respect," he said with a shrug. "I don't know how she did that, but I can tell you the way to unleash your own strength." Everyone's eyes lit up. They knew that Charles understood how to tap into one's inner power better than anyone else, and they were eager to hear his advice. "No one else can use the lightning sword ability like Miranda can," he said. "This isn't just because of her incredible talent, but also because of her conviction. Soul energy is a very special kind of power that resonates with a person's heart. When someone sincerely wants to do something, their soul energy responds to their desire." Alice gaped at him in awe. "So you're saying that I can do the same thing as her?" she asked. Charles shook his head. "Having a firm conviction in something is just a way to speed things up," he said. "But your personal goals determine the path your powers take. Miranda wants to be as powerful as I am more than anything else, and her ability reflects that goal. You, on the other hand, want to live a stable life. So even though your real talent is controlling ice, you're better at controlling water right now." Alice was silent, realizing that Charles had seen right through her. She wasn't interested in strength at all. She only wanted a stable life amid the horrors of the post-apocalyptic world, and having a partner she could rely on was more than enough for her. She felt that controlling water would help Charles, and that Charles would in turn offer her the stability she desired. Since soul energy resonated with a person's deepest wishes, her water powers had developed accordingly. At the same time, her ice powers had fallen by the wayside. Everyone felt a bit strange, like they had just realized something very important, but couldn't quite put it into words. But they didn't have time to sit around and think about what that realization might be. As they journeyed on, they moved quickly to their destination, not even stopping to rest at night. On the way, Charles found some sets of wolf tracks. He wanted to follow them, but after tracing their path for a short distance, the tracks disappeared completely. Charles was puzzled by their disappearance, but instead of dwelling on it, he continued on his way. The situation had changed yet again, and he knew he had to make the best use of his time. After 2 days and 1 night of long-distance raids, Charles finally told his troops to rest. Their stopping point was a marker indicating that they had reached the border of Ontario, Canada. After arriving there, everyone finally realized what their true destination was: the largest and deepest of the Great Lakes, Lake Superior. Although they didn't know why Charles wanted to go there, everyone believed that he had to have his reasons for doing so. While the troops rested, Charles summoned several hellhounds, and then he released the Dark Legion. Under the protection of so many hellish creatures, the entire camp was impregnable. Nevertheless, the scouts took turns keeping watch for any approaching danger. Several enemies tried to attack the camp that night, but no matter how sneakily they approached, they couldn't break through the camp's defenses. Wanting to join in on the action, Jenny gathered more than a dozen mutated cranes and flew out to fight under the hellhounds' watchful eyes. After a night full of fighting and some fitful attempts at rest, the Dawnians woke before sunrise the next morning and wearily assessed the damage their forces had taken. The Dark Legion had suffered a handful of casualties defending the camp, but Charles wasn't fazed by their loss. Even the Legion itself didn't seem to care about the fallen warriors. When dawn broke, the group traveled for an hour and arrived at Lake Superior. Lake Superior was 350 miles long and 160 miles wide, bigger than some states in America. Due to the changes in the energy of heaven and earth, It was cold all year round and covered in powdery snow that glistened in the glow of the dawn sunlight. If only the sun was as bright as it was before the apocalypse, Charles thought, the lake would be an even more impressive sight. Looking at the frozen lake in front of him, Quentin sighed wistfully. I always wanted to come here when I was younger, he said. I thought I'd never get the chance to see it after the apocalypse. Alice's face beamed with wonder as she took in all of the breathtaking landscape around her. We're here to fight, not to sightsee, Elena teased. We should be thinking of ways to keep warm. Jenny left Elena's side and cradled a crane egg in her arms. Why aren't you hatching yet? She whispered to it. If you don't hurry up, I'm going to boil you and have you for breakfast. She wasn't particularly attached to most animals. After all, she had had to hunt many of them along the way. But she had grown fond of the little cranes, and she decided to try to hatch the eggs. Charles could have found a suitable environment in the energy storage space to hatch the eggs, but since Jenny seemed to enjoy trying to incubate them, he decided to let her do as she pleased. There were 26 cranes total, and about 80 unhatched eggs on top of that. If all of them hatched, they would become a powerful asset. Just a month after it had hatched, the strongest baby crane was already at level 4, showing that the creatures held tremendous potential. As the bitter wind whipped around the cranes, they started to shiver. They flapped over to the fire horses and perched on their backs to warm themselves up. After the apocalypse had caused a drastic climate change, the temperature in the lake area had plummeted to minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Faced with such bone-numbing cold, even the paranormals needed special clothes to survive, and the baby cranes were particularly ill-equipped to handle the harsh temperatures. Seeing the cranes trembling, Jenny went to Charles's side and tugged at his arm. He turned to look at her and she pointed at the cranes. Can you help them? She asked, pouting. Her puppy dog eyes were his biggest weakness. He didn't want to look like a heartless jerk who bullied a little girl in front of everyone, so after pausing for a moment, he begrudgingly agreed. He took out a hellfire lily seed, plopped it in a large bucket of water, and handed it to Jenny. Have them drink this, he said. It'll keep them warm. Her pout flipping into a wide grin, Jenny skipped over to the cranes with a bucket clutched to her chest. Elena sighed. You spoil her too much, she said to Charles. Anything to make her happy, he replied. She's worth whatever it takes. After observing the snowy scenery for a while, Charles started to get down to business. Send the nightmare horses away for now, he said to his troops. He'll be splitting up into 5 teams and surveying the area on foot to see if you find anything unusual. Enjoy the view, but don't let your guard down. He thought for a moment, and then he summoned some hellhounds, assigning 2 of them per team. We're in no rush, he added. Just have a look around. The scouts cheered with joy, realizing that Charles was giving them a chance to sightsee after all. Traveling and enjoying the scenery in the post-apocalyptic era was a luxury, but since they were already there, he decided it wouldn't hurt to give the Dawnians some time to unwind. After all, they had gone through many dangerous missions without a real break, and it seemed as good a time to relax as any. Charles knew that with the hellhounds protecting them, they would be safe from most dangers in the area, and the only thing that would threaten them would be an accident. If they can't even have a little fun when it's relatively safe to do so, then what's the point of living? He thought as he watched them wander off. After they had left, he turned his gaze to Alice. Come over here and have a look, he said to her. Is there something under the ice? She leaned close to the ice for a few seconds. I can't sense any signs of life, she said. There should be a lot of mutated beasts under the ice, but I can't tell how powerful they are if I can't feel their presence. If there's anything down there, though, it could be dangerous. Charles nodded. If they're not in a hurry to attack us, then we don't have to be in a hurry either, he said with a smile. Let's look around with the others. In the next few hours, Charles, Alice, Elena, and a few others walked around the lake, admiring the snowy wonderland around them. As they wandered, they collected some plants that had managed to survive in the frigid climate. Charles created a snowy biome in the energy storage space and placed the plants there. Then he watered them with some essence water to help them grow. He'd created several other experimental areas in the space, knowing that while he might not have a use for the plants and creatures he kept there yet, he could need them in the future. Especially with the looming threat of the glacier era, having some cold hardy plants could possibly come in handy. The various plants he had collected from Hell were resilient against the heat and flames there, but even those powerful plants wouldn't be able to survive in such a harsh environment as the lakeside. Charles knew that the overwhelming cold likely had produced particularly strong specimens, and he had no concerns about decimating the local flora to collect whatever he thought looked potentially useful. As Alice walked alongside him, she enjoyed the brief break from all of the bloodshed. For that short moment, she didn't need to worry about the ever-present dangers of the post-apocalyptic world. All she cared about was spending time with Charles. The group explored the area for 5 hours, returning back to camp when the sun finally dipped behind the mountains. The scouts also returned with their hearts full, infinitely grateful they had had the chance to forget all of their problems for even just a moment. That night, Charles didn't ask them to set up camp right away. Instead, he led them to a nearby city that had once been a famous tourist spot. Before the apocalypse had begun, he'd wanted to vacation with Lena there, but their family hadn't been able to afford the trip. When they arrived in the city, all they found were thousands of corpses and an eerie silence. Covered in a thick sheet of ice, the corpses looked like they had been mauled by some sort of creature. Some of their expressions were frozen in horror, clearly terrified of what they had seen right before death. "It doesn't seem like they were eaten by zombies," a scout said, examining one of the corpses. "The wounds are more like something a wild animal would cause." The rest of the scouts snapped out of their daydreams of more snowy escapades and got to work investigating the city. Soon after, Quentin stopped and turned to the others. "Zombies or humans didn't do this," he said. "It looks like it was wolves." "There are thousands of bodies here, right?" Elena said. "And that's just in this one city. The wolf pack would have to be huge to kill this many people." Everyone's faces were etched with concern. They had encountered Gideon more than once in the past few days, and it seemed he was more alert and cunning than they had realized. At that moment, a furious roar sounded from afar. Although Charles couldn't hear its source clearly, he used his soul energy to scan the area and sensed where it was coming from. He homed in on a group of people in the distance and listened to what they said to each other. "Who did this?" one cried. "Was it those damn zombies again?" "No," another replied. "If the zombies did it, they would have become zombies too." "Whatever monster did this, I'm going to skin them alive," a third said, gritting his teeth. Some of the people in the distance were heading in Charles's direction. When they saw him and the other Dawnians standing in the city, they shouted angrily. "Did you do this?" one man yelled. "I'll kill you all!" At that moment, more than a dozen muscular warriors holding ice machetes rushed toward the Dawnians, while a few other people behind them used their superpowers to attack from a distance. The scouts knew that they didn't have the luxury of being polite when others took the initiative to attack them without warning, so they launched a merciless counterattack of their own. A red light flashed, and blood splashed everywhere. A dozen of the enemies who had been at the front lines collapsed into the snow. Davin's hands released a dazzling light, which blinded the enemy's backline fighters. Then Quentin, Joshua, and the others rushed forward to slay their foes. "Leave one alive," Charles ordered as he watched them fight. "Got it," Joshua replied, carrying a half-dead warrior over and throwing him at Charles's feet. "He's all yours." Charles stepped on the man's chest. "It seems there's been a bit of a misunderstanding here," he said. "We didn't kill those people. Wolves did. We just happened to find them when we were passing by." "Then why are you guys here?" the man said, spitting out a mouthful of blood. Charles pushed his foot down even harder, so hard that he pushed the man's last breath right out of his chest as he crushed him to death. "If we hadn't been as strong as we are, we could have died to these fools over nothing," he said to the Dawnians. "This guy's lucky I let him die in peace." After watching the carnage unfold in the city, a group of muscular men and women wearing leather armor rushed over to confront the Dawnians. "We've never done anything to harm you," one woman said, glaring at Charles. "You knew it was just a misunderstanding, and you killed our friends anyway. You're a monster." The area was deathly silent at night, so the group had easily heard the fight and Charles's explanation for it, and it had made them fly into a rage. Quentin and the others lined up behind Charles, awaiting his instructions. "Your friends attacked us first, and you're questioning us?" Charles asked, sneering. "We were just defending ourselves." The group of enemies glared at Charles, but a man who seemed to be their leader reached out his hand, gesturing for the others to back off. Seeing that the other party wasn't about to attack, the Dawnian scouts also stepped back, but they remained on guard in case the enemy changed their mind. "You're right," the leader replied. "We were in the wrong just now. I know our friends were very strong, and it'd be incredibly difficult to stop their attack without killing them." He took 2 steps forward and looked at the corpses of his companions. "But even if they were wrong, They were still our friends. Well, you're all outsiders, and you'll pay for their deaths with your own blood." As he spoke, the warriors around him prepared themselves for battle. Charles shook his head and sighed. So much for being reasonable, he thought. Although he knew his troops could dispose of the group, he knew Gideon was a greater threat, and he didn't want to waste time and energy fighting anyone they didn't need to. "Wait a minute," he said to the leader. "Don't you want to avenge the residents of this city? Surely you know that if you fight us, no one will survive to do so." The leader stopped in his tracks. "Is that a threat?" As he spoke, the temperature in the air seemed to drop by a few degrees. What a joke, Charles thought. I'd never be foolish enough to threaten them, especially right now. They're an infamously dangerous group even outside of Ontario. They're not called berserkers for nothing. "That's not what I meant," he said. "What I meant was that the person controlling the wolf pack and I are enemies, and my troops and I are here to hunt him down. I know how to find him, too." He gestured to the mangled and frozen stiff corpses of the city's residents. "You're well aware how strong an enemy force had to be to take out a town full of warriors like this," he said. "And I don't think you want your friends here to never be able to rest in peace while their murderer walks free." "You'd better not be lying to me," the berserker leader said. "If you are, I won't hesitate to make you pay for it." He looked at the corpses strewn all over the ground and half covered with snow, and clenched his fists. "All right," he said, "but don't think I'll just let you go after what you did. We can work together to destroy our enemy, and we'll avenge our friends after that." While Charles had killed the man's friends because of a simple misunderstanding, thousands of his compatriots in the city had been turned into nothing more than wolf food. For that moment, his hatred for Charles was drowned out by his overwhelming rage against whoever had disrespected the citizens' lives so severely. So, he was willing to work together with Charles temporarily and settle the score later. Charles was a bit taken aback by the man's stubbornness. "Fine then," he said. "You can come with us." As he spoke, he summoned a hellhound and ordered it to pick up the wolves' scent and start tracking them. At the same time, he also extracted some blood from the citizens' corpses. If the hellhound failed to track the wolves, he could use the tracking amulet to do it himself. Meanwhile, the scouts felt a pang of regret over the battle. "If only I could have taken them down without hurting them," Quentin said sadly. "I'm sick of all this senseless bloodshed." But it was too late. The conflict between the two sides had already started, and there was no way to stop it. Joshua looked at the corpses on the ground. "When these people fought, they didn't think about defending themselves at all," he said. "I think they thrive in fighting when their lives are on the line. We did what we had to in order to save ourselves." When the berserkers fought, they never considered the difference in strength between them and their opponents. No matter how strong their opponents were, they would fearlessly battle with all their might, sometimes whipping themselves into a frenzy with their bloodlust. This trait often caused them a world of hurt, but it absolutely terrified their opponents. To the berserkers, losing one of their comrades wasn't much different from losing all of them, so when Charles and the Daunians had counterattacked them, they might as well have declared war. The rest of the berserkers agreed with their leader's plan. The conflict between the two sides had originated from a misunderstanding, and their grudge against the Daunians was personal. But they knew they had a greater foe that they had to stop, and so they had to put their desire for vengeance on the shelf for the time being. Whether they died avenging their fallen friends or the city's citizens, they would die without regrets. Working together in their temporary truce, the Daunians and the berserkers found some wolf tracks and started to follow them out of the city. Although the berserkers didn't have mounts, they were able to keep up with the Daunians due to their strength and stamina. The massacre in the city had happened quickly. The berserkers had been staying there, but had left for a short while, and they had found the citizens' corpses and the Daunians there when they had returned. Although they could track the wolves based on their footprints, Charles knew that the wolves were so fast that the trail might have already gone cold, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. After an hour of tracking, he gestured for his troops and the berserkers to stop. Then he disappeared into the night. A moment later, he stood in front of the group with the bodies of two giant wolves that were more than 15 feet long each. "These wolves were keeping watch," he said. "It seems like the valley up ahead would be the perfect spot for the enemy to set up camp." He turned to the berserkers. "I know you're in a hurry," he said, "but if you can give me just a moment, I'll make sure that they won't be able to get away." The leader nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's pen them in." Charles thought the berserkers were a strange bunch. As long as they liked someone, they would believe them. But even if they believed someone, it wouldn't stop them from killing them on a whim. They acted with their hearts instead of their brains. At their leader's orders, the group of berserkers began to set up an ambush on one side of the valley. Meanwhile, Charles brought his team to the other side of the valley, and then he summoned the Dark Legion there. After the groups had prepared to launch their attack, they heard a series of loud howls pierce through the quiet of night, echoing throughout the valley as more wolves joined in. That's not good, Charles thought. They must have sensed our presence. We have to act now. Let's go, he shouted at his team. The Daunians rode their nightmare horses into the valley. Before they had arrived in the valley, they had changed from their fur coats into dark iron armor in preparation for battle. Their figures gleamed in the moonlight as they flew through the snow. After traveling a short distance, they encountered a pack of wolves. Kill them all, Charles cried. He and Elena rushed out ahead of the group, blocking the front of the pack with their horses. They each unsheathed their swords, which burst with a dazzling red light that shone brightly in the night sky. Then they struck the wolves down, leaving a trail of corpses in their wake. Damn it, Gideon muttered as he watched the scene from the other side of the valley. It's those guys again. He was riding on top of a giant wolf, and the silver-furred Wolf King stood beside him. As the new Wolf King was a prideful beast just like the other had been, it wouldn't let Gideon ride on its back. A group of herders rode their horses behind Gideon. Sir, would you like us to deal with them? One of them asked. There aren't many of them. We should be able to handle it so you don't have to waste your time getting your hands dirty. All right, I'll leave it to you, Gideon replied. Then he led a large number of wolves toward the other end of the valley. The battle with Charles had cast a shadow on him. Even though he had more than 1,000 wolves under his command, he still didn't want to waste his resources on dealing with the Daunians again. Trusting his wolves more than the herders, he sent 200 of them to accompany the herders in a battle, and they all rushed toward the Daunians. We're going to feed your corpses to the Wolf King for dinner, one herder shouted. You messed with the wrong people. There were only about 80 herders in the grassland, and all of them were elite fighters, which is why Gideon had kept them around instead of feeding them to the wolves. But if they stepped out of line or failed in battle, he wouldn't hesitate to change his mind about that. The Daunians drew their weapons, ready to kill whoever got in their way. Even Jenny was involved in the battle. Charles didn't want her to have to kill people yet, especially since she was still so young. But Elena felt that her daughter had experienced enough of the horrors of battle that she could handle it if she had to. She also knew that even if Jenny didn't want to kill people, she could still participate in the battle in other ways and heal the injured Daunians. When Sylvia had taken some of Jenny's power, Jenny had also taken some of Sylvia's healing ability. Although she had a powerful holy light sword to fight with, she much preferred healing people over harming them. The moment the two sides clashed, it was clear that the fight wouldn't be a fair one. Charles and Elena drew arcs in the air with their swords, easily cutting down the herders and their horses with them. Quentin, Joshua, and the others at level 6 were also some of the strongest Daunian fighters, and the herders were no match for their brutal attacks. One nightmare horse charged at the wolves, piercing their throats with its mighty horn and killing them instantly, while its rider took out several others with his scimitar. The fighters' curved blades, forged from crimson flame energy gems, could cut through the defense of a level 6 being with their sharpness alone. The herders were practically defenseless against such powerful weapons, and the one-sided nature of the battle left them dumbfounded. They had thought that it would simply be a battle of numbers, as with the wolves by their side, they outnumbered the Daunians. But they hadn't expected the Daunians to be such terrifyingly strong opponents. We're no match for them, one herder cried. We have to retreat. But we can't just run away, another replied. If we retreat, then the Wolf King will kill us all for sure. We have to force them back no matter what. There's a little girl over there, a third said. Let's try to take her as a hostage. The herders had captured many hostages before, and they hadn't hesitated to use them as human shields when they needed to in battle. So when they saw a seemingly helpless little girl on the battlefield, they thought they had found an easy mark. Seeing the herders galloping their horses toward Jenny, Alice's eyes turned cold. She created a thick wall of ice in front of their path, stopping them in their tracks and buying time for Elena to jump at them. Elena fully unleashed her Terminator sword ability. As its incredible yet frightening power flooded her body, she felt like she was limitless. When she brandished her sword, she didn't need to worry about defending herself. Her onslaught was so aggressive that it left no room for any enemy attacks. Seeing Elena kill the herders that were lunging at her, Jenny's eyes filled with fear. But that fear was quickly replaced by determination. I want to be strong, she thought, clenching her fist. No, I need to be strong. She summoned a beam of light energy with her hands, targeting Elena and the other Daunians' injuries. She still couldn't bring herself to kill another human being, but she knew she could at least help to heal her allies. The battle lasted less than 5 minutes, but the entire valley was covered in enemy corpses, wolves and herders alike. "Move forward," Charles ordered, and the Daunians followed his command. Meanwhile, on the other side of the valley, a similarly intense battle erupted. "Kill those bastards!" one of the berserkers shouted. "Don't let any of them out of here alive!" "An eye for an eye!" another cried out. "We won't let you get away with massacring our people!" The berserkers blocked the other end of the valley, preventing the enemy's escape. Just as Gideon was about to ride through on his giant wolf, they ambushed him. With the giant wolf's keen sense of smell, it could tell there was a trap ahead. But because Gideon was rushing to escape, he led them right into danger. Caught off guard, the rest of the wolf pack suffered tremendous casualties. Most of the berserkers held strange machetes that emitted cold air, freezing the wounds of any creature they struck so severely that all their blood vessels froze in turn. When the Daunians and the berserkers had fought, they'd only survived because of their dark iron armor. If the Daunians hadn't been so well equipped, some of them would have died in the battle. The berserkers were known for ruthlessly fighting without caring for their own lives. Even berserker paranormals would cast spells and attack with their swords at the same time, leaving no way for them to defend themselves. The only thing between them and death was a shroud of protective soul energy that surrounded their bodies. The berserkers recklessly slashed at the wolves with all of their strength, and in the face of such a relentless attack, the wolves had no chance to fight back. "So what if we killed some people in that city?" one of the herders cried. "Do they really need to launch a full-on attack like this to get revenge?" "Since you all seem to want to die instead of actually being useful in battle, then no, they don't," Gideon replied angrily. "They have a monster tailing us, and we don't have a chance against it." Charles and the Daunians were stunned that Gideon had sensed the Hellhounds' presence. Gideon knew that his wolves were no match for Hellhounds, and he wanted to avoid any more casualties if possible. He had been looking to slaughter his enemy, not to fight a drawn-out battle of attrition with them, and when the odds turned against him, he knew it was time to retreat. The Wolf King slashed at one of the berserkers with its massive claws. "Die, you mutt!" the berserker shouted, desperately grasping the long blade in his hand as the last bit of his strength poured into it. He lashed out at the wolf, leaving a tiny scar on its side. This scar was only a few inches long, barely visible on the gargantuan wolf's body. But to the Wolf King, it was a blow to its pride more than to its body. The wolf let out an angry roar, and then it ate the berserker alive. Gideon ordered more than a dozen wolves to run toward the mountain peaks on both sides of the valley. The mountains weren't steep, so the wolves swiftly bounded to the top. But soon after they had summited the mountains, the wolves' bodies rolled right back down into the valley. "So that guy really didn't lie to me," the berserker leader muttered to himself, grinning. "He does have a way to deal with them." He burst with an intense aura. "The enemy's escape route has been cut off," he shouted to the others. "Time to make some nice fur coats out of all those wolves." The berserkers whooped with excitement, their morale at an all-time high as they rushed into battle again. One after another, their battered bodies fell into the snow, but they took down even more wolves with them. "Why does it have to end like this?" Gideon let out a roar of grief and indignation as he watched the berserkers slaughter his wolves. He had a feeling that the valley was going to be his burial ground. At that moment, the Wolf King looked up and saw a huge shadow circling in the sky. "It's the Black Lightning Dragon," it said, the fur on its back standing on end. Gideon's heart skipped a beat when he saw the dragon flying overhead. He knew that with the dragon attacking from above, and the berserkers blocking his way, he was as good as dead. Just as he had accepted his fate, a thunderous roar of horse hooves came from the other side of the valley. "Cut them down," Charles shouted to both sides of the valley, and the Dark Legion rushed down and attacked the wolves. The Black Lightning Dragon floated lazily in the air, keeping a bird's-eye view on Gideon in case he had any tricks up his sleeve. As the Dark Legion joined the battle, Gideon and the wolves' odds seemed even more hopeless. Although the wolves were fearless, and there were more than 1,000 of them, most of them were only at level 4, and the Dark Legion troops were just as powerful. And even if they somehow managed to deal with the Dark Legion, there was still the threat of the Hellhounds. "Since there's nowhere to run, then let's fight to the death," Gideon shouted. He chopped the berserker in front of him to the ground with his saber, realizing that since he was completely outmatched, fighting for his life was his only option. In such a desperate situation, the wolves fought like the cornered animals they were, displaying combat strength far beyond their level. Although there were about 80 berserkers, compared to the Dark Legion and the Daunians, they were the weakest fighters of the group. But that didn't faze them, and they tried their best to prevent Gideon from escaping. "This ends here, Gideon," Charles shouted with Bullet at his side, his face furrowed with determination. Soon after, Bullet burst forward so fast that it looked like a flickering bolt of black and purple lightning, kicking up shimmering plumes of snow as it bounded through the valley. It tore right through 2 giant wolves that blocked its path, while Charles ran toward Gideon at full speed. Seeing that Charles was getting closer, Gideon ordered a few wolves to stand by his side. The Wolf King let out a furious roar. Just as it was about to step forward to protect its master, the Black Lightning Dragon in the air suddenly released a bolt of black lightning that landed on the wolf's body. The wolf spat out a mouthful of frosty air, which collided with the black lightning and neutralized its power. But while the Wolf King was distracted, Charles had already approached Gideon. Using his Divine Wrath ability to summon a golden spear that crackled with energy, he pierced right through 3 giant wolves and into Gideon's body. The spear exploded, and the deafening sound of the blast resonated through the valley amid the pained howls of the wolves. The explosion of Charles's Divine Wrath spear blasted Gideon to smithereens. The blast shot out in all directions, killing 10 giant wolves nearby. The Wolf King howled with grief and indignation to see so many of its pack members slain. Then it turned its sights on Charles. It ran at him at top speed with fury in its eyes, outraged that a human had dared to kill its companions. Charles focused his sword energy into his left arm and swiped at the wolf as it pounced on him. The wolf's broken body collapsed to the ground. Then the Black Lightning Dragon descended from the sky, took the body into its mouth, and swallowed it. And the Wolf King was at level 6, thought Charles. Its energy will surely boost the Black Lightning Dragon somewhere close to level 7. He hadn't known much about the new Wolf King, only that it was extremely powerful, and that it would provide the Black Lightning Dragon with a significant amount of energy. After the death of their king, many of the surviving wolves pounced on the humans. Meanwhile, several others turned around and tried to flee. However, their escape was foiled when they ran into the Dark Legion, which was aided by the Black Lightning Dragon. The giant demons carried large shields and easily blocked their way. The wolves could see that if they tried to leap over the giant demons, they would then have to contend with the blade demons waiting behind them. They were also backed up by the magma monsters, who were highly skilled spear users and would easily be able to kill any wolves that crossed the defenses. Charles had planned the formation well in advance. Back when he had trained the Dark Legion in Hell, he had made sure to select soldiers whose attacks and skills complemented each other. As a result, they presented a line of defense that would be almost impossible to breach. With no path of escape, the wolves were forced to fight for their lives. Their desperation only made them more vicious. A few giant wolves pounced on Joshua at the same time. He was only able to escape by launching his Nightmare Horse into the air, propelling off one of the giant wolves to leap high enough to break free. As soon as he had landed, though, a few other giant wolves blocked his path. He swung his Crimson Flame blade at them, cutting off their heads with only a few sword strokes. However, the rest of the giant wolves rushed in, taking advantage of his brief setback to attack him. The Crimson Flame blade slashed in every direction, making easy work of the wolves. They were in such a frenzy after the deaths of both Gideon and the Wolf King that they seemed to no longer care for their own safety, wishing only to take down Joshua before they themselves were killed. Joshua saw another group of wolves rush at him. I guess it's time to find out if my dark iron armor is strong enough to stop wolf teeth, he thought. Just before the wolves reached him, though, his Nightmare Horse's horn shot out a beam of light that pierced the throat of the giant wolf leading the attack. It buckled and fell to the ground, choking for breath. "Good shot!" cried Joshua, and he used the wolves' confusion to escape the new attack. The remaining giant wolves were undeterred, though, and they continued to pursue him. They didn't care if they met their end at the point of his Crimson Flame blade, as long as they could make an opportunity for their fellow pack members. Just then, a flaming meteor streaked down from the sky, blasting the wolves and sending them flying. Although it killed many of them, its blast propelled the remaining wolves closer to Joshua. He glanced back and saw that Charles had cast the meteor. Charles tried to keep up with every area of the battlefield and help out wherever he could. Anytime he saw one of his followers trapped by the wolves' frenzied onslaught, he cast an assisting attack to give them a chance to escape.
No matter how ferocious the wolves' attack was, they simply couldn't contend with Charles and his followers. As their number decreased, the members of the Dark Legion closed ever inward, limiting their space for maneuvering and further protecting the scouts. Although the battle was still fierce, the Legion's coordination ensured that the situation was gradually stabilized. The only real losses sustained by Charles's army were some nightmare horses who had been mortally injured in their fight with the wolves. The situation with the Berserkers wasn't quite so optimistic. Although their ice swords were extremely powerful, the giant wolves were so fierce that they hardly gave the Berserkers a chance to use them. Still, the wolves attacked so carelessly that the Berserkers were able to make a little headway. At one point, just after a Berserker had managed to kill a wolf, another wolf arrived and bit him in the arm. Meanwhile, a third wolf lunged forward. The Berserker turned to face that wolf, but then a fourth came from nowhere and bit his throat, taking him down. Charles knew that he would be able to save more people if he used his full strength, but he was reluctant to do so. He was already responsible for 3 separate armies: the Daunians, the Berserkers, and the Dark Legion. He felt that he was already doing his best to support those armies, and he could hardly be expected to unleash his full wrath to make things easier for them. Besides, he knew that the forces already in play would be sufficient to defeat the wolves. The Dark Legion was so strong that even if the wolves fought for all they were worth, they wouldn't be able to break through. The Dark Legion and the Daunian scouts continued to kill more wolves. Meanwhile, Charles counted the remaining Berserkers. Seeing that they were toiling, he ran to help. He took down 12 wolves with 12 perfect sword strokes. Once he had joined the battle, the wolves' bodies piled up much faster around the Berserkers. Before long, the ground was stained red with blood, while the giant wolf corpses were already beginning to freeze. Even after all the wolves had been killed, the Berserkers kept hacking at the dead bodies in frenzied glee. "That's enough," ordered Charles. "You already got your revenge." Other than the whistling of the icy wind, the valley was silent. The battle was finally over, and the Berserkers had calmed down. Of all the armies, the Berserkers had suffered the most casualties. The Dark Legion had also sustained some losses, while Charles's followers had all survived. Meanwhile, only 15 Berserkers remained, and those few survivors were all exhausted and covered in wounds. It was clear that they were too fatigued to go chasing after any more wolves. Besides, as Charles had said, they had already taken their revenge. The leader of the Berserkers approached Charles. "Thank you," he said. "Without your help, we wouldn't have been able to defend ourselves against the wolves, let alone get our revenge on them. Even though you tricked us into fighting them so we wouldn't be able to attack you, you still made sure we avenged the people the wolves killed in the city." Charles was silent, surprised that the Berserkers had seen through his plan, and yet were still thankful. The battle had benefited both parties. The Berserkers had gotten their revenge on the wolves, while Charles had been able to kill Gideon. In so doing, he had also been able to weaken the overall strength of the Berserkers, which meant his own followers had undermined a potential enemy. He was glad that the Berserkers' desire for vengeance had trumped all else, so they had been willing to fight even though they had known they would suffer casualties. "If you promise to pose us no further threat, I'll let you go," said Charles. "You killed the wolves. I hope you can see there's no reason for you to continue fighting us too." The leader of the Berserkers shook his head. "Think of it this way," he said. "If we killed your teammates, wouldn't you take any chance you could to take revenge on us?" Charles was silent. He didn't have the patience for such hypothetical questions, and he wouldn't have entertained that one if he wasn't in such a good mood after his plan had gone successfully. As far as he was aware, if one of his followers was killed, he wouldn't think twice about punishing whoever was responsible. If he didn't seek vengeance on behalf of his followers, people would see no reason to follow him in the first place. In fact, 2 of his main responsibilities as the leader of Dawn City were avenging any followers who died under his care and ensuring that their families were taken care of. "I accept responsibility for what's happened here," said the leader of the Berserkers. "I didn't discipline my subordinates well enough, and it led to their deaths. I wouldn't have been able to live it down if I hadn't at least tried to make amends for that." The Berserkers behind him were so moved by their leader's speech that some began to cry. They couldn't believe that their leader would speak about them with such fondness. It was so cold, though, that their tears soon froze on their cheeks. "What's your name?" Charles asked the Berserker leader. There weren't many people whose names he cared to learn, but the leader had proven himself worthy of respect. "Noah Crow," said the man. He pointed his sword up the lake shore. "Follow the path along the lakeside to the northeast. After a while, you'll come across an ice crystal mine. That's what our swords are made of. You're free to take some of the ore. Since you made it all the way here, I assume you have some space-powered people on your side. If you don't, you'll have problems collecting the ore. If you come across any berserkers, I ask you not to harm them. If they attack you first, though, I won't blame you for retaliating. As you know, I deliberately tricked you into fighting, said Charles, smiling bitterly. I didn't expect you to trust me so much after that. In fact, you haven't just thanked me, you've also told me the location of an ice crystal mine. Why? And if you're happy to tell me about it, why don't you let the rest of the country know? He wasn't sure of Noah's motives for telling him about the mine. It seemed unlikely that he was lying, because by that point he knew how strong Charles was, and how easily he would be able to hunt him down and punish him. I'm only telling you about it because I owe you, said Noah. You and your followers made a great sacrifice when you helped us fight the wolves. Of course, you already know why you don't need to worry about us spreading the news any further. Charles could sense that he had something else to say, but couldn't find the words. I have one final request, Noah said at last. I know you're not going to let us walk away from here alive, so I want you to kill us with your strongest move so we can die with honor. Without hesitation, Charles summoned his Divine Wrath spear, realizing that Noah had truly seen right through him. In his previous life, he hadn't been powerful enough to use the spear too often without sapping his energy, but he was much stronger in his new life and was able to supplement his power with extract amulets. The spear flickered with white lightning as he lifted it above his head. Then he plunged it through Noah's heart, while the lightning and flames spread to the other berserkers. They fell to the ground, the true fire burning their bodies to ashes so that no corpses will be left behind to attract zombies and mutated beasts. Why do humans have to kill other humans? Asked Jenny when the flames had died. Don't we have enough killing to do, defending against the monsters? Everyone nearby looked uncomfortable at such an innocent question. They tried to tell themselves that they weren't ashamed of their actions, and that it was a simple fact of their new lives that they had to commit such horrible acts. They couldn't deny that killing other humans felt unnatural, but over the past few months, they had largely become numb to their guilt. They worried that their own humanity might be fading away. That's a big question with many answers, said Charles. Even I'm not sure which one is correct. Maybe you'll find it someday and teach it to us all. Jenny nodded, although she hadn't understood what Charles had said. Charles looked around the valley, which was stained with blood. The blood in the wounds of the dead bodies had frozen up. His gaze fell on the wolves that the berserkers had continued attacking, even after they had been killed. It's a pity, he said with a sigh. We could have used their hides. Charles and the scouts traveled to the ice crystal mine that Noah had mentioned, killing the various monsters that beset them on the way. The mine was situated in the ice wastes, close to the berserkers' home. Ice crystals could be used to refine cold iron, which could be forged into weapons with the power to freeze the enemy. Charles hadn't recognized those properties when they had been fighting the berserkers, but that was only because the berserkers' forging abilities were too limited to make the most of them. He knew that in the future, their forging skills would develop, and when they had finally mastered them, they would form the infamous Army of Ice. Although weapons forged from ice crystals weren't suitable for everyone, they were particularly useful for water-type paranormals. Any weapons that they couldn't use would be stored in Dawn City or sold for a good price. When they reached the mine, Charles ordered his team to set up camp. Then he ordered the giant demons from the Dark Legion to begin mining, depositing the ore in the energy storage space. The commotion from the mining attracted many mutated beasts, but by that point, the scouts had grown powerful enough that they easily dealt with them. After the work had started, Charles contacted the trading party on his communication token. He learned that the onslaught of mutated beasts in the Midwest had been stabilized, thanks largely to the equipment and supplies that Dawn City had been able to provide. The mutated beasts had devastated a great deal of the farmland during their attack, which would otherwise have been a terrible loss for the area. However, because Dawn City had been able to supply food, the Midwesterners have been able to afford to use the farmland as bait, making it much easier to defeat the beasts and reclaim their land. In that time, Dawn City had enjoyed an abundant harvest, and because they had been so generous with their prices for the equipment they had sold to the military in the Midwest, the military had sold Dawn City beast bones and hides for a similarly low price. Once the Dawnians sold those items to the eastern states, they would easily make up for the amount they had lost by giving such a discount on the original equipment. In all, then, Charles's generous prices would return to him as healthy profits. Meanwhile, the Knights of Hell had displayed such tremendous fighting skills that they had earned the respect of the Midwest military, and they would be able to use their prestige to call on the Midwest for military support if they needed it in the future. After ending the call, Charles contacted Olivia. Her news wasn't quite as positive. "The sea level is getting higher and higher," she said. "A large number of coastal cities have already been submerged. According to super squads on patrol at the coast, lots of aquatic beasts have started to come ashore. For the time being, they're easy enough to kill. They aren't used to being on land, and the super squads haven't had any problems beating them back. But their number is growing, and they'll only get stronger in time." Charles felt a chill go through him. He realized that when he had killed the giant turtle, it had amounted to a declaration of war against all the aquatic creatures that his opponent might throw at him. He was still in the dark about the other party's motives, but he hadn't expected things to come to that. Whoever the enemy was, he knew they had to have used some special method to accelerate the evolution of the sea creatures so that they could survive on land. He had to assume that they were only waiting for that evolution to reach a certain point before they targeted Dawn City. Charles realized that if he didn't want to repeat the disasters of his previous life, he had to prepare himself for another battle. "Since people are already aware of what's going on, spread the news," said Charles. "Assure people that there's no need to panic. I'll come back and deal with it soon." He then sent a message to Tina, asking her to prepare to return to Dawn City. The next news he received was that the Super Squad Guild had grown in strength, with its membership at that point standing at over 100,000. 5,000 people made up the groups who were dedicated to hunting zombies and beasts before bringing their various resources back to the main super squads. With those resources, even the lower-level squad members were able to support themselves. People had recognized the great power of the Super Squad Guild, and they often turned to them for help in defeating enemies that were too powerful for them to take on alone. In addition to the Super Squad members, some people had also taken on the role of scavengers. They weren't strong enough to get all their resources from hunting monsters, so they helped the super squads with menial tasks, such as moving supplies. In return, the super squads gave them food and protection. As a result, the super squads grew even larger. It was no surprise then that their influence and respect had expanded so widely. Moreover, the development of the super squads had limited the activity of those factions who would otherwise have terrorized innocent people. After that update, Charles felt a little more at ease. Thanks in part to the super squads, there were far more survivors in his new life than there had been at the same point in his previous life. It gave him hope that humanity would have a much greater chance at survival in the face of any future disasters. He felt confident that, if things carried on in the same way, they might bring peace not only to Dawn City, but to the country at large. Even if a crisis does break out in Dawn City, it'll take a while to have an effect, he thought. Still, I'll need to make sure to root out any potential problems before they can build up momentum. He looked out over the frozen surface of Lake Superior, distracted by a change in its energy. As he probed further, he detected a dangerous aura coming from underneath the ice. While the giant demons were busy mining ice crystals, the scouts searched the surrounding area for nearby enemies, killing any monsters they came across. Although at one point they came across a team of berserkers, both sides held back from fighting and managed to evade a conflict entirely. If the scouts hadn't learned from their encounter with Noah's group, they would have attacked without thinking. However, they had learned from their previous dealings with the berserkers not to attack them. In fact, they had begun to consider their previous fight with the group to be an accident. Anyway, the scouts knew it was unlikely that the berserkers would attack them when they saw the giant demons on their side. Following instructions from Charles, Alice was busy gathering water from the lake. Charles knew that freshwater supplies would run so low in the future that people would begin fighting one another for access to it. Any water they were able to take from Lake Superior would be a valuable asset in times to come. For that reason, Charles had refined dozens of water pearls for Alice, each of which could store a large amount of water. However, the lake was so big that even after filling all the pearls, she would still only have taken a small percentage of the lake water. Meanwhile, Charles was also extracting some of the lake water. Rather than using water pearls, he was sending it directly into the energy storage space. He was able to use the world's will to turn himself into a sort of channel between the lake and the storage space, allowing him to direct the water into it with great efficiency. He didn't intend to take all the water. He had estimated that 10% of the lake would be sufficient. That would be a large enough amount to ensure they had a substantial supply, but not so much to cause any diplomatic issues if the nearby berserkers learned he had taken it. He knew how important Lake Superior would be for the berserkers' development in the future, and that if he completely emptied the lake, they would have good reason to seek retribution. It wasn't that he was afraid of trouble. but he was wise enough to know there was no sense in causing unnecessary friction. Although he could sense that the aura beneath the lake's surface was growing, he pretended not to be aware of it and carried on with his task. From time to time, he would transport the ice crystals that the giant demons had mined into the energy storage space. After 3 days of work, Charles and Alice had gathered half of the water that they were aiming for. Charles lamented that they would have worked faster if Alice's strength had been higher, and if his own water abilities were greater. Still, underneath the ice, the water level was several feet lower than when they had started. At one point, when Charles entered the energy storage space to check on the water level, his attention was caught by a scroll bearing the image of a wolf. It was a common image in that area. He remembered that the scroll had originally been sewn onto a jacket that had been taken from the battlefield after the fight with Gideon. At the time, he had considered it as useless as the other clothes they had taken as spoils of war. He had burned the clothes, but the scroll had evidently survived the blaze. He was surprised to see that it wasn't even singed. He tried to burn it with true fire, but again the flames left no mark at all. He picked it up and used his soul energy to inspect it. Strangely, the wolf totem image seemed to be alive. From it, he could sense the howling of wolves. He tried to use his energy to communicate with it, and almost immediately sensed a chaotic and enormous will from the other side. However, he was powerful enough that he was able to overpower the will. There really is a wolf totem, he thought. This must be how Gideon was able to create a new wolf king after I killed the first one. The people of that area regarded wolves almost as gods. The changes that had come about since the beginning of the apocalypse had instilled the totem with their fierce affinity with the wolves. It was so strong that the bearer of the totem could use it to communicate with the wolves directly. Charles knew the totem had to be what had enabled Gideon to grow so close with the creatures, essentially becoming their pack leader. This totem was already suffused with the people's belief in the wolves, thought Charles. Gideon exploited that to control and subdue the creatures. He finally understood that that was how Gideon had been able to create and control the Wolf Kings. He called the scouts. They came rushing to him at once, awaiting his instructions. Charles pointed in 2 directions. "I can sense groups of wolves in both directions," he said. "I want you to catch as many of them as possible. Once you've caught them, let me know and I'll come and collect them. I don't care if they're injured as long as they're still alive." The scouts didn't ask any questions or wait for further instructions, and they left to follow his orders immediately. They knew everything they did for Charles would be rewarded with merit points, which they would then be able to use to develop their own strength. So it benefited them to follow his orders to the letter, even when they didn't agree with, or even fully understand them. They didn't fear Charles's difficult missions. What they feared was that he might not give them any missions at all. Once they had left, Charles smiled to think that he would soon have wolves under his control. Not as companions, but as servants. It wouldn't matter if the wolves initially refused to bow to him. With the wolf totem, he knew that he would be able to subdue them in time. Although Charles already had the Cerberus pack under his control, he was always eager to add to his forces, and so he didn't think twice about using the wolf totem to subjugate as many wolves as he could. He heard from the first group of scouts within half an hour. He rushed to their location and found that they had captured a large number of white wolves whose legs had been broken. Some dead ones lay nearby, their bodies marred with teeth marks. "We managed to keep these ones alive, but over 30 of the wolves died," said Joshua. "When some of them were unable to fight back, others killed them so that we wouldn't be able to control them. These are the ones that couldn't escape." The injured wolves whimpered with fear. It was clear that losing their ability to move was even more devastating than death. Why are there so many wolves in these parts? Charles wondered. He knew that the area around the lake was an inhospitable place, and that due to the limited amount of food, there usually weren't many wolves there at all. Even considering the changes brought on by the apocalypse, it didn't make sense that there were as many wolves as they had come across. He quickly figured out the reason. In all of their travels to the north, the Dawnians have been ambushed by all kinds of monsters. However, none of the monsters have been able to deal much damage to them. It had felt all along that their enemy had set up some kind of trap for them, waiting for Charles to order a large-scale attack. He guessed that the enemy had summoned or somehow created those wolves in order to stall him and his followers. The enemy has been busy the last few days, he thought. After seeing how many wolves were in the area, he realized he couldn't afford to underestimate his opponent. He moved the injured wolves into the energy storage space before heading to the next group of scouts. In all, the scouts had already captured more than 700 wolves. More than 300 of them were cubs. In addition, they had collected a large number of furs. After putting the wolves into the energy storage space, Charles could sense that there was something unusual about the souls of the pack leaders, and so he killed them without hesitation. After he had done so, the other wolves started to show signs of resistance. However, it was too late for them to resist, as they were already trapped in the energy storage space. Charles cast a few lightning bolts at them, and they quickly calmed down. He then set about subjecting the wolves to a ruthless training regime. By the time he was done, more than 30 of them lay dead in the storage space. Those were the wolves that had fought back, seeming to prefer death over servitude. If they refused to bend to Charles's will, he had no qualms about killing them. Although the rest of the wolves didn't immediately surrender, they had learned that they would only survive if they followed Charles's orders. Still, he could clearly see the hatred in their eyes, and it was clear that they were only biding their time before they could spot an opportunity to overthrow him. But he didn't care about that. He couldn't see that any beast would ever be intelligent enough to outsmart him. Although the wolves were cunning, he was confident that they would all yield to him in the end. Even if they didn't, he would be able to subdue a sufficient number to make up a strong force. He was in no hurry. He had plenty of time to teach them the dangers of disobeying him. Although they were stronger-willed than most of the other creatures he had tried to subdue, he knew he would break them in the end. Once he had calmed them somewhat, he used the wolf totem to establish a connection with them. The totem would let him control them no matter which breed of wolves they were. Once he had made the connection, he could feel their souls tremble. He ordered them to treat him as their god, even as one of their own kind. After he had finished, they no longer saw him as a human who had dominated them, but as a wolf who led them. His conviction that they had come to regard him as another wolf made him realize that the reason Gideon had been unable to ride on the back of the Wolf Kings was that they had seen it as unnatural as one wolf riding on the back of another. However, even though the kinship inspired by the wolf totem meant that the wolves would trust Charles completely, he knew that he would need to display his strength regularly in order to keep them on side, just as the leader of any pack would need to do. Charles returned his consciousness to the real world. I need to figure out the energy storage space's coordinates in the real world, he thought. Otherwise, I'll only ever be able to enter it with my mind and not my physical body. The energy storage space comprised a world in and of itself. At that point, its only connection to the human world was Charles himself, whose consciousness acted as a bridge between the two. Across that bridge, he could transport both matter and energy, but he himself couldn't enter the space. If he ever wanted to do so, he would need to establish a new bridge, across which he would be able to pass. However, that was easier said than done, and he knew that he wouldn't be able to achieve it anytime soon. After all, he was busy spending most of his time and energy finding ways to manage and protect all the people who depended on him, in Dawn City and elsewhere. He simply didn't have the resources to spend on finding a way to allow him to physically enter the energy storage space. Maybe I can focus on it when I've dealt with the sea creatures, he thought. Then he received a distress signal coming from Alice. It didn't surprise him at all. He knew what it alluded to. Has the time come already? He wondered. Yes, I could sense some eyes observing me in the darkness. I knew this was going to happen soon. It's a good thing I was prepared. Charles didn't think of himself as a particularly smart person, but he did always think things through. He knew that in the post-apocalyptic era, strength was the most important thing. But he also knew it was naive to think that strength alone was enough to survive. A strong person might have been able to destroy their enemies, but none of that mattered if they couldn't keep the people they cared about safe. After all, once someone was dead, they were gone forever. His own rebirth had been a rarity, and he didn't dare place his hopes on it happening again. Charles left immediately after he received the distress signal. Meanwhile, Alice followed his instructions to keep collecting water from Lake Superior, using water pearls. But she was uneasy. With Charles and the Daunians gone, not to mention the powerful black lightning dragon that had been protecting them all, a feeling of emptiness settled over her. What's wrong with you? She thought. Get a hold of yourself. You're a level 6 paranormal now, for goodness' sake. The young cranes that had become Jenny's companions flapped their wings frantically and began circling her. Jenny sensed their panic, but she didn't know what the problem was. What's wrong? She asked. Elena's hand flew to her sword, and all her muscles tensed in preparation for a fight. At the same time, Alice summoned 8 water nymphs to stand protectively in front of her. With a great splash, The surface of the lake exploded as a 20-foot-long crocodile launched itself out of the water and landed on the water nymphs. The nymphs were killed, but their sacrifice gave Alice enough time to retreat and think of a new tactic. She was always calm in moments of crisis, which was an unusual and useful ability. She decided to use her water wall technique to create a barrier in front of her. Water gushed out of the lake and formed a huge wall that was 100 feet wide and 6 feet thick. More giant crocodiles crawled out of the lake, and they all attacked the water wall. Their claws penetrated it easily, but because the wall was made of liquid, it didn't break. The water wall technique didn't produce as strong of a barrier as the ice wall technique, but an ice wall would have shattered instantly under the crocodile's claws. All the water wall did was slow them down and buy Alice a few seconds, but that was all she needed. By the time 7 crocodiles had passed through the water wall, she'd made it to the relative safety of the cluster of Dark Legion demons. The giant demons stopped their work and picked up their shields and axes. The blade demons and shadow demons also took their positions and prepared for battle. When the danger had first begun, Elena had wanted to help Alice, but when she saw how quickly Alice had reacted to save herself, Elena pulled her daughter behind the Dark Legion. "How are there crocodiles in this lake?" she asked in surprise. Lake Superior was a popular tourist attraction, so she didn't understand how the crocodiles could have gotten in there, but one after another climbed onto the shore and rushed toward the Dark Legion. "Get ready to fight!" Alice yelled. She waved her hand and a large amount of natural water appeared beside her. Water-type paranormals could use pure soul energy to conjure water, but controlling existing water instead saved energy. The giant crocodiles collided with the giant demons as shields, knocking 2 of them off their feet. The other demons swiftly retaliated by stabbing several of the crocodiles with long spears. Although the spears pierced the crocodiles' skin, the spearheads didn't go very deep. The damage they caused was insignificant, considering the massive size of the crocodiles, who continued to surge forward. Hundreds of giant wolves have been unable to break through the Dark Legion's formation, but the giant crocodiles broke through as if it were nothing. Alice waved her hand, and the water around her formed chains that bound the 5 crocodiles closest to her. The chains turned to ice and tied the crocodiles firmly to the ground. A few giant demons raised their shields and used all their own weight to fiercely smash them into the crocodiles. Elena activated her Terminator sword ability, and a powerful deadly aura surrounded her and her Crimson Flame sword. She stabbed a crocodile's head, piercing its skull. Destructive energy flowed from the sword into the wound and killed the crocodile. Another crocodile snapped at her, but 2 blade demons and 2 shadow demons stepped in front of her to block the blow. One of the blade demons was crushed by the crocodile's heavy body, and the other's arm was broken by its strong claws. The 2 shadow demons were sent flying. But the demons didn't dare give up. They knew that if one of the Daunians died, the entire Dark Legion would be destroyed as well. Jenny seized an opportunity to attack with her Holy Light sword, which had black patterns on its hilt. She swung at a crocodile, and the sword cut through its body like a hot knife through butter. "Jenny, get back!" Alice shouted. Jenny didn't dare disobey, and she immediately retreated. By that point, more than 40 crocodiles had come out of the lake to attack. Elena, Alice, and the Dark Legion were working together to fight them off, but it was proving to be very difficult. When she had escaped the first wave of crocodiles by running to the Dark Legion, Alice had sent a distress signal to Charles, asking him to come quickly, but she didn't know how soon he would return. The battle had reached a stalemate when a rumbling sound drew everyone's attention to the lake, where another creature was emerging. Its neck, over 30 feet long, appeared first, followed by a faint shadow under the surface that outlined its massive body. "What is that thing?" Alice wondered aloud. Her first thoughts were of the Loch Ness Monster, which the creature resembled. It also looked like some kind of dinosaur. "We should call it the Lake Superior Monster," she thought dryly, "or the Water Dinosaur." The huge monster slowly crawled out of the lake. Then a blue light appeared in its mouth, and it spat a thick column of water at the Dark Legion. More than a dozen giant demons were knocked down by the water column, breaking their formation once again. "Oh no," Alice exclaimed as the water dinosaur attacked. She summoned another dozen water nymphs to cover the holes in the Dark Legion's formation, but the nymphs were nothing compared to the giant crocodiles. Elena had inherited the Terminator sword ability from Charles and had learned how to use it under his guidance. She was the only one who could deal fatal damage to the crocodiles, but she wasn't able to kill them very quickly. As soon as the water dinosaur took out the first row of giant demons with its spray of water, the crocodiles charged. Fortunately, the Dark Legion had the advantage of numbers, so they quickly adjusted their formation to encircle the crocodiles. A swarm of insects chose that moment to surround them. Jenny poured her energy into the holy light sword in her hand and used it to easily kill the bugs. But afterward, her face grew pale from the exertion. The giant crocodiles and the Dark Legion fought each other, and Elena tried her best to kill as many crocodiles as possible. While they were all preoccupied, the water dinosaur slowly lifted itself from the lake. Once it was entirely out of the water, everyone could see more clearly that it did indeed resemble a dinosaur. It had a long, slender neck and an enormous body. They all watched as it spat another stream of water from its mouth, once again breaking the giant demons' formation. They fell, dropping their shields, and the crocodiles pounced on them and killed them. Alice let loose an involuntary scream. She had seen many terrifying things during her time with Charles, but it was only when he wasn't around that she understood how powerful their enemies were. Charles had always been there to protect her, but without him, she felt weak and useless. No, I won't fall apart, she thought, strengthening her resolve. She sent a large ball of water toward a few of the crocodiles, trapping them inside. They waved their huge claws frantically, but their struggles were futile. They couldn't break out of the watery prison. Elena swung her crimson flame sword and killed another crocodile. Are we really so helpless without Charles here? She thought. She'd already killed 5 giant crocodiles, but it had taken a lot of energy. Jenny used her holy light to help Elena recover a portion of her strength, but it wasn't so easy to replenish the energy that the Terminator's sword ability had consumed. The water dinosaur came toward them, and with every step it took, the ground shook. Alice's face grew pale at its approach. The onslaught of insects was endless. It would have been impractical for Alice, Elena, and Jenny to leave the Dark Legion and try to catch up with Charles. But there were a limited number of the demons, and if the water dinosaur continued to wreak havoc, the Dark Legion would soon be eliminated, leaving the 3 of them unprotected. Then another dark figure rose from the depths of the lake, and Alice's heart skipped a beat when she recognized its shape. It's another giant turtle, she cried. She knew that even Charles had had trouble defeating a giant turtle before, and that the new one was bound to be even stronger than the previous one. She thought that there was no way they could face both the turtle and the water dragon at the same time. No, Alice told herself again. I can do this, even without Charles. With her determination renewed, she swept a huge wave of water over the crocodiles. The water turned into chains of ice that firmly pressed the crocodiles to the ground. A long spear made of ice appeared in her hand. She threw the first spear toward the water dinosaur, but the monster spat out another ball of water, knocking the spear off course. It brushed past the water dinosaur's neck harmlessly. The giant turtle released its own burst of water, which turned into a long dragon made of ice. It circled through the air, and then it rushed straight toward Jenny. They're after Jenny, Alice shouted. In desperation, she summoned her own ice dragon to fight with the one the turtle had created. But when the 2 dragons collided, Alice's was destroyed in no time at all. No, she cried. The turtle's ice dragon was getting closer and closer to Jenny. Alice was filled with despair, and she recklessly threw herself in front of Jenny. Elena had just finished killing one of the crocodiles that Alice had immobilized, and she also rushed over to stand in front of Jenny. Then the cross necklace Jenny was wearing emitted holy light, which shot out in front of Alice and Elena, creating a barrier. With a loud noise, the ice dragon collided with the holy light barrier, which shattered upon impact. Then the ice dragon flew toward them again. Alice knew then that the monsters they were facing had to be level 7. She had seen Charles kill level 7 monsters like it was nothing, but only when she was personally facing such high-level monsters did she understand how terrifying they truly were. Elena looked even more scared than Alice did. She had fought level 7 monsters in hell, but somehow the giant turtle and the water monster were more frightening, perhaps because there was no way to measure their strength. As the ice dragon drew closer, fury built in Alice's heart. She longed for the strength she needed, even if she had to draw upon the power of the gate of hell. It didn't matter to her. I will find the strength, she thought. Then a voice spoke to her, and Alice wondered if she was hallucinating. Don't worry, the voice said. With me here, there's no need for you to sacrifice yourself. She thought it might have been Charles's voice. He was the one who had sealed the gate of hell after all. A golden leaf appeared on her chest. It launched a golden barrier between them and their enemies. Alice was startled. Is this because of the protection amulet? She wondered aloud. Charles had given a protection amulet to every member of the Knights of Hell, but she hadn't thought it could do much in a battle of that level. The spiraling ice dragon crashed into the golden barrier and smashed itself into pieces. But the barrier wasn't damaged in the slightest. It firmly protected Alice, Elena, and Jenny. Then a door opened in the barrier, and a grayish-brown monster with 2 heads came out. They were all shocked by the appearance of a 2-headed hellhound. "Where's the enemy?" it asked, looking around. When it spotted the giant turtle and the water dinosaur, it narrowed its eyes and it said, "Leave it to me." The giant turtle was angry that its plan had been thwarted by Charles. "That damned human," it said. "I didn't expect him to be so cunning." Alice had relaxed a little when the 2-headed hellhound had appeared, but she was somewhat frustrated that I hadn't started fighting their enemies yet. "I don't think Charles will be happy to see you just standing around," she said. The 2-headed hellhound shook its head. "You don't understand what the turtle means," it said. The water dinosaur laughed. It could also speak, and it asked, "Did you think a mere 2-headed hellhound could stop us?" It released some more water from its mouth. The 2-headed hellhound hurled a black ball of true fire, which hit the water and vaporized it. The fire kept going toward the water dinosaur, but before it could reach the monster, the turtle expelled a mouthful of white ice balls that collided with the true hellfire. From its other mouth, the 2-headed hellhound spat out a ray of black light that hit the ice balls with a resounding boom. The intense explosion stirred up smoke and dust in the sky, and the loud sound made Alice's eardrums swell. Is this all it takes to destroy a level 7 monster? She wondered in shock. But the smoke and dust dispersed, revealing that the turtle and the water dinosaur were safe and sound. The explosion hadn't hurt them at all. How are we supposed to fight this? Alice thought in dismay. Elena was also discouraged and afraid. She had seen a level 7 battle in hell, but she had neglected to consider one thing. Even though she knew what a level 7 monster was like in hell, things were different on Earth. The creatures in hell were too used to hellfire, so fire attacks were rarely used, and even then only in support. Instead, they relied on close-quarters combat, targeting their enemies' vital points with their fists. It was a brutally effective but limited tactic. On Earth, though, level 7 creatures wouldn't let their enemies get that close. Elena also knew that the monsters they were fighting weren't normal level 7s. The giant turtle was in its sealed state. That, along with the natural powers of its species, made its strength unfathomable. "Get ready to retreat," the 2-headed hellhound shouted. "I can only use a limited number of depth rays, and once they're gone, I only have hellfire left to rely on. I'm no match for a giant turtle." It was humble and honest about its limitations. "Can't you summon some of your companions to help?" Alice asked. The hellhound shook its head. "No. My summoning contract is confined to your protection amulet. When you encounter a crisis, a protection amulet will activate, and I'll appear. But it can't be activated very many times. Our pack doesn't have that much freedom." The Cerberus pack had their own territory in hell that they patrolled and hunted in. If a few of them were occasionally summoned to battle on Earth, it wouldn't cause any issues. But if too many hellhounds were summoned, they would leave their territory vulnerable. That was why Charles would only summon a large number of hellhounds when he was dealing with a particularly dangerous enemy. Otherwise, only a few would have to suffice. Such a summoning would not only affect him, but also the Cerberus pack. "Then we can only stall for time," Elena said. She clenched the Crimson Flame Sword tightly, ready to begin a long battle. The turtle spat out another ice dragon toward the 2-headed hellhound, which used another death ray. The two collided with a violent shockwave that stirred up a huge cloud of dust and made the ground unstable. The Dark Legion demons stumbled, and even Alice and Elena had to lean against the giant demon to keep from falling. While the hellhound and the turtle fought, the water dinosaur sprayed some more water on the giant demons. Some of the giant crocodiles broke free from their ice chains and killed a few of the demons. When the turtle saw that most of the demons' shields were made from the shells of other giant turtles, it was furious. In its eyes, giant turtles were a noble race, but the filthy creatures from hell had sullied its bloodline. "How dare you use the shells of my relatives to forge your shields?" it yelled. "That's unforgivable." Jenny shook with fright. She felt helpless. The two-headed hellhound was already exhausted. It didn't have a lot of strength left, and replenishing its energy was difficult. "No, I have to protect Mommy and Alice," Jenny thought with determination. She still trembled in fear, but she pulled her shoulders back and stood tall, gripping the holy light sword tightly. She knew she had to fight until the last moment. The young crane she had adopted circled around her. They weren't yet mature, but they would protect her with all the strength they had. "Hurry up and capture the girl," the turtle ordered. "If we don't get her before that other human comes back, we'll be in trouble." Although the giant turtle that had provoked Charles before had been killed, the new turtle knew about Charles, and knew that it had just been presented with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The monsters didn't have much time to attack, and if they messed it up, they probably wouldn't get another chance. The water dinosaur took advantage of the distraction created by the battle between the turtle and the hellhound. It advanced toward the Dark Legion with huge, thundering steps. Its eyes were fixed on Jenny, and they were full of greed. It could see that Jenny was extraordinary. Part of it longed to eat her, but it knew that if it did so, it wouldn't live for much longer. The two-headed hellhound spat out true fire from one mouth and black light from the other. The two projectiles combined and rushed toward the giant turtle. "As expected, you're growing weak," the turtle said. "Is that the only move you know?" The turtle sent another ice ball to neutralize the hellhound's attack. By that time, the water dinosaur had reached the Dark Legion. It stretched its slender neck toward Jenny. Alice's and Elena's eyes widened. They were both prepared to block the monster's blow. Charles had given Alice the protection amulet, but she had no idea how many times it could be used, and she didn't dare place all of their hopes on it. Then a flash of white lightning appeared out of nowhere and flew into the water dinosaur's mouth. Alice recognized it as Charles's divine wrath. The white lightning exploded in the water dinosaur's mouth, blowing its head to pieces. But that wasn't the end of Charles's retribution. The lightning's destructive aura went down the water dinosaur's throat and into its stomach, blasting its internal organs to smithereens. Its enormous body fell to the ground. When Alice saw Charles, her heart was filled with joy. She'd been so afraid the whole time he was gone, but his return brought her peace. She knew that as long as he was there, they wouldn't encounter any more problems. "Impossible!" the giant turtle exclaimed. "It should have taken you a lot longer to come back. How did you get here so quickly?" "Looks like you really were spying on me with those bugs," Charles teased, or else you wouldn't have known that. Bullet neighed and trotted to Charles's side. When the turtle saw the horse, it understood how Charles had gotten back much quicker than it had calculated. "So, your horse has already reached level 7, it asked. Bullet had always been considered the strongest of all the nightmare horses. But after Charles had raised Bullet to level 7, the horse's speed had increased dramatically, making it easy for Charles to rush back just in time. He had used 3 level 7 crystal cores to help Bullet break through to level 7 as fast as possible, and that had increased Bullet's speed by 50%. The turtle had a lot of information about Charles, but that had caused it to get overconfident about how well it knew him. It realized it had made a big mistake. Charles walked toward the turtle, his steps unhurried, as if he had no plan and all the time in the world. "When I killed that giant turtle before, I was disappointed that its shell didn't make many shields," he said lazily. "I never thought another one would come knocking at my door so soon." The turtle looked up and saw the black lightning dragon circling in the sky. "Retreat," it called. It knew that if it continued the battle, it wouldn't win. Charles had already killed one giant turtle, which meant that he knew how to break through its defenses. For the sake of its own safety, the turtle needed to return to familiar terrain. It turned toward the lake, preparing to draw some water from it to use as a shield to cover its retreat. But as it tried to do so, it discovered that the surface of the lake had been sealed by an invisible force. "Do you think I'm new at this?" Charles mocked. He calmly crossed the battlefield and approached the turtle. I've just been waiting for an opportunity to cut off your escape. The last time he had encountered a giant turtle, he had almost let it escape to the bottom of the lake. But he had made more preparations since then. The two-headed hellhound spat black hellfire at the turtle, but a blue halo appeared around the turtle, blocking the fire. The turtle was especially good at physical defense strategies. Its dark golden shell began to glow brightly. "You've made me angry," it said. "I'm not the same as that weakling you killed last time, and I'll make you pay for your arrogance." As it spoke, all four of its legs, as well as its head and tail, shrank back into the shell, and its aura grew stronger. Then 12 golden amulets rose up from underneath its body, and another 10 golden amulets appeared in the sky above it. The amulets rotated unceasingly, forming a whirlwind around the turtle. "Don't even think about it," Charles said. "Since you've sealed your own power, I won't let you unseal it." Golden light shone in Charles's hand. One after another, sealing extract amulets flew in from all directions and entered the turtle's body. A golden chain appeared and bound the turtle to the 22 amulets swirling around it. "How is this possible? How can you use the seal in my body?" it asked. Because the Earth had limitations, the turtle needed to seal part of its power to allow itself to exist there. It had been about to remove the seal so it could escape Earth, but then it realized that the seal had been reinforced instead. Charles didn't explain in detail how he had done so. He just kept hold of the golden chain. The turtle became weaker. Its own seal had merged with the seal that Charles had added, forming an incomparably firm seal. Its aura quickly fell to level 5. Charles had developed the sealing method himself using the extract amulet system in the nameless ancient book. He called it the sealed lock. He'd used his power like a key, turning a lock shut inside the turtle's existing seal. After which, he effectively removed the keyhole. The turtle was trapped on Earth and limited to the strength of its own body. Charles's method was similar to how the Lord of the Underworld had cursed the Cerberus Pack. The sealing technique not only sealed the opponent's strength, but it also sealed their condition. It allowed a seal with a small amount of strength to still achieve a great result. But it had taken Charles a few days to prepare. The whole time he had been waiting beside Lake Superior, he had done all he could to keep the enemy in the dark while he actively prepared himself. "No!" the turtle cried, starting to panic. "What do you want, you hateful human?" It had a bad feeling. If Charles wanted to kill it, that was his prime opportunity. But it wondered if the detestable human wanted to capture it alive instead, and its guess was correct. Charles began refining the turtle's endless power and circulating it directly into his energy storage space. "I'm going to kill you," the turtle threatened. "Let me go, or the entire human race will suffer because of you. The destruction of this planet will be your fault." Its voice grew weaker and feebler with each word. Eventually, it lowered its head as it lost consciousness. After only a few minutes, Charles put the unconscious turtle into his energy storage space. After Charles put the giant turtle into his energy storage space, he sized up the battlefield. Without the support of the giant turtle and the water dinosaur, the giant crocodiles didn't seem nearly as powerful. Giant demons regained some strength and gained the upper hand in the fight. The situation was finally under their control, and Elena took the opportunity to kill a few more crocodiles. "There's no need to keep killing them," Charles said. He cut off the front and hind legs of the nearest crocodile, and then he did the same to 10 more crocodiles in just a few minutes. He put the legs into his energy storage space. He didn't plan to tame the crocodiles, but their skin was very valuable. The giant demons held the remaining crocodiles to the ground so that none of them could move. By the time all of that was done, the rest of the Daunians had also returned. "These crocodiles have rough skin and thick flesh. They're rare opponents for training," Charles said to Quentin and the others. "But you have to be careful. Work together and don't let anyone get hurt. That'd be embarrassing." 6 giant demons surrounded each crocodile, and the Daunians took turns sparring with the crocodiles. It seemed to Alice that in the blink of an eye, the battlefield had changed completely. She was a little sad that Charles had had to save them in the end. She'd wanted to be able to do some things by herself, but compared to the truly powerful enemy they had just faced, her strength was insignificant. Elena had a dissatisfied expression on her face as well. She understood then that Charles had just been using Jenny as bait. But she also knew that the monsters would have come anyway, even without Charles's interference. After all, he hadn't been their target. They had been after Jenny, and she wouldn't have been adequately protected if it hadn't been for Charles. So Elena wasn't upset with him. She did blame herself, though. "Is there a way for me to get more power?" she asked, turning to Charles. She thought about when Charles had given her the Divine Seed. She was very satisfied with the Terminator's sword ability, because it gave her power far beyond her peers. But even so, the enemy was too powerful. Charles shook his head. "We can't rush this. Even if I could give you more power, you wouldn't be able to handle it. You're already very strong. It's just that the enemy is stronger." While the Dawnians engaged in the special training he had ordered, he returned to his tent and sat down cross-legged. His mind entered the energy storage space, which sent a bit of soul energy into the giant turtle's body, waking it up, although it was still weakened. "What do you want?" the turtle asked. After refining the turtle's energy, the energy storage space's capacity had increased substantially. Any energy consumption its expansion had needed had been at the turtle's expense. The turtle looked around the space and scowled. "What kind of joke is this?" it thought. "This human has an entire world inside him." The turtle knew that wasn't something ordinary people could do, and it was wise enough to understand how terrifying that was. "Tell me what your goal is," Charles demanded. "Tell me everything you know about the water tablet and the Poseidon tablet. If you do that, then I'll give you a quick death." "You don't know what you're asking," the turtle said haughtily. "Do you really think I'll tell you anything?" "Looks like I'll have to teach you a few things before the interrogation," Charles said. A few bolts of lightning descended from the sky in the energy storage space and struck the turtle, burning his head and limbs until they were tender. All of the turtle's soul energy had already been extracted, so its ability to withstand attacks was limited to the strength of its physical body. Its shell was still relatively tough, but the flesh inside was fragile. After using the lightning, Charles burned the turtle with hellfire. It didn't take long for the air to smell like burnt flesh. The turtle cursed. "I'll never give in," it growled. Charles shook his head in disappointment. "You really don't live up to the legend of the giant turtle," he mocked. With his innate sword energy, he cut off 2 of the turtle's claws and threw them to the wolves that were in his energy storage space. Their eyes lit up when they saw the turtle's claws, and they fought one another for the chance to eat something so rich in energy. One wolf swallowed a large mouthful of meat. Before it could take a second bite, a powerful force spread through its body, attacking its bones and making it roll on the ground in pain. The other wolves didn't fare much better. At most, each could only take 1 bite of the turtles as meat. The turtle's body was over 65 feet long, and each of its legs was more than 20 feet long. There was enough meat for the wolves to eat for a long time and increase their levels. "How dare you do such a thing?" the turtle roared. It had never thought it would become another creature's food, and it was shocked and furious. "One day, our army will kill all of you humans," it went on, "and then you'll regret ever opposing us." "I've heard those threats before. Can't you come up with anything more creative?" Charles teased. "But don't worry, I've sealed your soul energy, so no matter how badly you're injured, you won't die here. I just hope your legs grow back fast. My wolves will need more to eat." Even as he mocked the turtle, he understood that his first attempt to interrogate it had failed. The turtle was a very proud creature. If not for the fact that it was a prisoner in his energy storage space, he was sure it would have tried to kill itself already, just to keep him from getting information. To the turtle, the lightning and hellfire Charles had unleashed upon it were no worse than the damage it might have received in battle. It didn't view those attacks as torture. But Charles wasn't in a hurry. He knew that the tougher a creature was, the longer an interrogation would take. In any case, the turtle was locked in his energy storage space and couldn't escape. He sighed and he asked himself, "I can't be more anxious than the creature I'm interrogating, can I?" A loud noise attracted Charles's attention. In the battle between the scouts and the giant crocodiles, a scout had been hit by the tail of one of the crocodiles, sending him flying over 20 yards away. He had crashed into the formation the giant demons had made, and he fell heavily to the ground, groaning in pain and dazed from the huge blow. Even if I'd been wearing my dark iron armor, I wouldn't have been a match for the giant crocodile, thought the scout. That thing can inflict a lot of damage. Alice came to his rescue with a healing technique to help him recover from his injuries. Sitting away from the main training area, the scout recovered well, his breathing steadying as the pain eased. The scouts knew they weren't up to dealing with giant crocodiles by themselves. Some of them fought the beasts in groups, while others watched from the sidelines. This particular scout was the 7th one who had been defeated by a giant crocodile. "What is it that makes them so difficult to beat?" asked the scout. "How have they managed to win against the elite fighters of the Dawn City Army?" "The giant crocodiles have very thick skin and are extremely strong," replied Alice. "If they bite us, our lives will be in danger. Even if they just hit us with their tails or claws, we'll be seriously injured." "The one that hit me certainly packed a punch," said the scout. "If it wasn't for that wall of giant demons, we wouldn't be able to carry out combat training like this, would we?" All the scouts understood why Charles wanted them to train against the giant crocodiles. They knew it was good for them to be challenged by fighting opponents stronger than they were, and the crocodiles weren't totally invincible. If a soldier used a crimson flame sword, they could pierce through the creature's eyes. And although giant crocodiles were less agile than many other animals, they weren't stupid and could take evasive action. In face-to-face combat, a soldier could expend all his energy and still not make much impact on a giant crocodile. The combat training lasted for nearly half an hour, and all the scouts were left out of breath by the end of the session. Some of them were perfectly capable of using their superpowers to attack the mouth of a giant crocodile with help from the other scouts, which would kill it quite easily. But that wasn't the point of the training exercise, and they had only been able to create a combat training scenario because they had the protection of the giant demons surrounding them. In real battles, the scouts had always felt they had lacked something, but they had never been able to identify what that something was. While they were all resting, Charles walked over to them and stood in the center of the group. "What's up with you guys?" he asked. "What's the problem here?" As much as the scouts wanted to roll their eyes, they didn't dare do that in front of Charles. They knew that if they had been allowed to use their special powers, they could have defeated the giant crocodiles. But they also knew they weren't capable of killing them with just their own strength. Charles could easily inflict very serious injuries on the crocodiles, but the scouts knew if they tried to imitate his methods, it would be them, not the crocodiles, who suffered serious injury. Fortunately for the scouts, some of them could use very powerful treatment techniques. Level 5 light element paranormals could heal broken bones, and level 6s could administer very effective emergency aid for both internal and external injuries. "When we were fighting with the crocodiles, we felt that we were lacking something," Quentin said. "But we didn't think it was just strength. We thought there must have been a flaw in our technique." The scouts all looked at Charles expectantly, waiting to hear what words of wisdom he would offer them. They all knew they didn't lack strength, but even a level 7 human couldn't compare to a level 6 giant crocodile. The giant crocodiles had the natural advantages of their species, and Quentin and the others didn't think there could possibly be a way of overcoming that. "Most of you have been to hell," said Charles. "But even if you haven't, being chosen as a member of this elite group is enough to prove that you're outstanding." Sitting down among the scouts, he went on in a conversational and formal tone that was unusual for him. "Let's talk about what you might be lacking," he said. "We know that you're all strong. We know that you're all highly experienced. And most importantly, you've all passed the test to become scouts, so you definitely don't lack combat skills." Everyone nodded. It made them very proud to hear Charles speak so highly of them. They were all considered heroes in Dawn City. "I know that you don't lack courage," Charles continued. "Every single one of you is brave enough to take on even level 7 enemies. So what is it that you lack? You understand that I don't let you use your special powers in these training sessions so that you can judge yourselves against the merits of an ordinary fighter, right?" The scouts all nodded. They knew their intuition in combat was as important as their strength and superpowers. Charles took out the crimson flame sword at his waist and showed it to everyone. "Look at this sword," he said. "This is the crimson flame sword I made for myself. It's over 3 feet long, nearly 6 inches wide, and 1 inch thick. Why do you think I made this sword to be like this?" Before anyone could answer, he took out another. "This one is a little under 3 feet long, 5 inches wide, and nearly 2 inches thick. Why did I make it look like this?" And why did I make this one curved? Joshua made some suggestions. Having 2 blades increases our effectiveness and makes it more likely that we'll be able to kill the enemy. One weapon sometimes isn't enough. It's very difficult to fight with a sword. You need to learn how to handle it and how to wield it quickly and smoothly. Charles nodded his agreement. You're right, he replied. The reason why I designed it like this is to maximize its lethality. Perhaps some people could use a longer sword, and some people could use a heavier sword. But weapons designers can't keep every individual who might use their weapon in mind while they're designing. Only a few of the greatest fighters have tailor-made swords. Charles's expression became more serious as he spoke. But combat skill isn't just about your ability with your weapons, is it? He continued. It's about wisdom, experience, and how you react to an enemy attacking you. Have you really thought about that? The scouts all thought about what Charles had just said about the combat skill, but they couldn't really answer his questions. How well did they use their combat experience? And did they put too much emphasis on their weapons? It's all too easy to rely on our armaments, said Charles. We know they'll always be effective. Our swords always sharp and deadly. We can't really do much to change our weapons. Of course, they're a vitally important part of our combat ability, and if you have a sword and your enemy doesn't, you're going to win hands down. The scouts nodded and listened intently. When we train for combat, we often focus heavily on the practicalities of swordsmanship, he continued. That includes how quickly we can wield our weapons and change position, our bodies' flexibility, and how fast on our feet we are. We work out specifically to increase our stamina and muscle strength, but there's so much more we can develop. I'm not just talking about strength and swordsmanship. Looking at the doubtful expressions on the scouts' faces, he went on. I can see you're not convinced. Let me show you what I mean. Watch carefully. Charles took out his crimson flame sword and walked toward a giant crocodile. Some of the giant demons were holding the crocodile down, and Charles told them to let it go. The scouts gasped in horror as the giant crocodile glared fiercely at Charles. They all wondered how on earth he would defeat it, but they had no doubt that he would do so. Charles walked steadily nearer and nearer to the crocodile, his stance very relaxed and calm. The deadly beast saw how comfortable Charles seemed, so it didn't rush to attack him. Instead, it crawled along the ground and prepared to kill him with one strike. When he was only 5 paces or so away from the crocodile, Charles lunged forward at it, his sword still held loosely in his hand. Suddenly, the crocodile moved, aiming at Charles's head with its huge, wide-open jaws, its teeth flashing. Although the scouts knew Charles was well prepared for the fight, they still looked on anxiously. They thought if they were facing a crocodile, they would want to dodge as much as possible. A bite from those huge jaws could easily be fatal, and serious injury was certain. But crocodiles could attack repeatedly, and constantly dodging around would tire anyone out very quickly. They had to find the right moment to attack with a sword, while still keeping clear of the crocodile's crushingly heavy body and dangerous sweeping tail. One flick from that could send a person flying and inflict terrible wounds. When the crocodile pounced at him, Charles moved quickly, but he didn't dodge to the side as the scouts would have done. Instead, he jumped up into the air very powerfully. The giant crocodile jumped as well, but Charles propelled himself higher, twisting and somersaulting through the air above the crocodile. He raised his sword at the exact moment that he passed close to its face, and he stabbed at its eyes. The scouts exclaimed and cheered, barely able to believe what they had just witnessed. They knew that Charles was stronger than they were, but they could jump just as fast and high as him. So in theory, they should be able to do what he had just done. But it was a very risky move. Timing was everything, especially when performing aerial gymnastics. But still, the giant crocodile battled on. It became more and more frenzied in its attack. Being a level 6 mutated beast, it was capable of inflicting serious damage. It swept its enormous heavy tail at Charles, its sheer power bringing back horrible memories to some of the scouts who had been on the receiving end of it previously. Charles spun round and dodged the crocodile's tail, and the beast carried on circling around and trying to bite him. Facing the crocodile's huge, gaping mouth, its teeth flashing dangerously, Charles turned his body very slightly. The crocodile didn't jump any higher into the air, but instead, it flipped its front legs upward, continuing to keep itself stable with its hind legs firmly planted on the ground. When Charles turned, the giant crocodile matched his move, spinning around quickly on its hind legs. Right at that moment, Charles moved back into his original position and stabbed at the crocodile's upper jaw with his Crimson Flame sword. He inflicted serious injuries to the crocodile's face, leaving it howling in pain. Hard on the heels of that attack, Charles swiftly slashed at its head, watching with great satisfaction as the crocodile collapsed weakly onto the ground. The scouts were astounded and fell silent in awe at what they had just seen. They realized that Charles hadn't done anything they weren't capable of doing. In theory, they would have been able to fight just the same battle and win as he had done. But what they hadn't been able to do was understand the crucial importance of the timing of the various moves and attacks. That's where the difference lay, and that's what Charles had mastered with such impressive success. Cultivating can increase your strength, explained Charles. And of course, it's very important. But because you've all seen strength as the most important aspect of combat, you neglected the other critical attributes. When you can't use your special powers, you need to know how to use all the other skills you have to their best advantage. That will determine whether you live or die. The scouts all fell silent. It was always a serious matter when Charles spoke to them about life and death in combat. From having watched him demonstrate his skills fighting the giant crocodile, and having listened to what he had told them afterward, they had realized something very important. Although they all had a huge amount of battle experience, they had pretty much always fought enemies weaker than themselves, no matter where those battles had taken place. Their opponents might have been at a higher level of cultivation, or physically stronger, but once weapons had been accounted for, the scouts had come out on top almost every time. So because the scouts had been used to using their physical strength and weapons to minimize how much soul energy they had to expend to defeat an enemy, their first reaction had always been to increase their strength or use their weapons to attack their opponents. In a battle to the death, survival was the most crucial thing. But at that moment, the scouts finally understood that using their potential was at least as important as all the other tactics they had at their disposal. Charles looked around at his scouts. The design of every weapon is the crystallization of countless people's blood and sweat, he said. Every single bit of human potential is our precious inheritance from our ancestors. Every battle they fought, every shred of experience they gained, is the foundation underpinning how we maximize our strength. Of course, you all pay great attention to improving your strength. But what is strength? Is it physical strength? Is it speed? What about agility? How about weapons? Or is it the sum of all these things? The scouts looked at each other, wondering if they were expected to answer. But before anyone could, Charles continued. You might well have individual answers to my question that suit your own purposes. But now I ask you this. Have you ever really thought about it seriously? The scouts remained silent. It seemed to them that they had been almost blindly increasing their strength without stopping to consider the impact of that on the rest of their combat skills. It sounded like Charles thought it had been to the detriment of their all-around ability. Have you thought about how to maximize the effectiveness of your weapons? Charles asked. Have you considered the best way to use your bodies? And what about your soul energy? It may be true that absolute strength crushes everything, but it doesn't seem to me that you even know what strength really is, let alone absolute strength. Sheathing his sword, Charles turned away from the scouts. He had taught them all he could of swordsmanship and cultivation techniques. If the scouts are satisfied with just increasing their physical strength and cultivation levels, there's nothing more I can do, he thought. But my requirements are much greater than that, and I hope they can live up to the standards I've set for them. If I make my expectations of them clear, perhaps that'll inspire them to raise their game. The scouts continued their training, and Charles started analyzing how their opponents had attacked and how he could further increase his own strength. His knowledge from the mysterious ancient book had ensured that as long as he cultivated and learned level by level, he would be able to grow continuously stronger. But he set himself very high standards, and he always wanted to push himself beyond what the ancient writings required. He wanted to discover a path for himself from among the endless possibilities that the energy storage space and the extract amulets provided. A few days passed, and the water level in Lake Superior dropped by several feet. Such an obvious change had already attracted the attention of the local people, and some of them had already begun to investigate why the water level had fallen. The Berserkers had also sent some specialist teams to Lake Superior, and more were on their way. When Charles heard the news, he dispatched the Dark Legion and led his team to find a hiding place. He had seen many strange things happen, and he knew that the upheaval America had experienced had been replicated across the world. so to him it didn't seem at all strange that the water level in the lake had fallen. But he thought it wise not to get involved in the investigations around Lake Superior, knowing that his very presence could be a provocation to the local people. He had witnessed their anger once before, and he knew that only a few of them were reasonable. He didn't want to risk a fight unnecessarily. Meanwhile, Charles went into the energy storage space to see how the giant turtles were recovering, and to see what was going on with the white wolves. After the wolves had eaten the flesh of the giant turtle, their strength had clearly increased. A lot of them had reached level 4 and could take part in battles, and the increase in their levels was still going on. Several of the mature wolves had reached level 5. Their spectacular growth rate hadn't happened just because they had eaten giant turtle meat. They had eaten several different types of mutant animals, all very rich in protein and energy, making them very robust. Having watched the white wolves gradually growing stronger and stronger, Charles had an idea. He took the heart of the water dinosaur, chopped it up, and fed it to the cranes. He was concerned that the cranes' life force might be too low for them to cope with eating giant turtle meat, so he started them off on water dinosaur heart. If they grew strong enough from eating that, he would let them have giant turtle meat. He also killed a fish to add to the cranes' diet every day, because he knew it would help them digest the water dinosaur heart. With Charles's nurturing, the cranes reached level 4, and one of them reached level 5. The scouts had improved a lot during their most recent round of training exercises. On the surface, there didn't seem to be very much change in their strength, but their spirits had lifted enormously, and their temperament had become much more even. One day, while Charles was busy preparing food and feeding the cranes, there were strange changes in the sky, and unusual sounds from some distance away. Looking up, he saw a huge white building slowly appearing above Lake Superior. A water mansion slowly came into being above the surface of Lake Superior, and the local people rushed to look at it. They were all shocked by what they saw. An enormous white building, looking as though it was carved out of ice and snow, floated above the lake. When everyone viewed it from below, they could only see fog. When they looked at it from the side, they could see that it was a mansion. Some of the paranormals built tall platforms to climb up and look at it more closely, but no matter how high they went, they still couldn't see the top. It attracted a very large number of people who came to stare at it, including the berserkers, the grassland herders, and people from America. Many thought they had received a supernatural call drawing them to see the water mansion. "I heard the call to come here from the wolf god," said one. "We will draw power from this place and conquer the world." The crowd grew steadily, and everyone seemed to be in high spirits. "Could this be the legendary ruins?" asked someone. "Life is so strange these days that nothing surprises me anymore. Could it be that I've been brought here for a special purpose?" Another group of visitors began fantasizing about becoming people chosen to receive an ancient inheritance and going on to conquer other countries. But they knew their thoughts were all just fantasy, dreams brought about by such an amazing sight. Charles's team also pretended to be attracted by the strange scene. They put on their wolfskin coats and went to the northern side of Lake Superior. "Are you the chosen one?" Alice asked Charles. "Is that why we're all here?" "The chosen one?" replied Charles, raising an eyebrow in amusement. "You think that place looks like heaven?" "Is it dangerous in there?" asked Alice in surprise. "You bet it is," said Elena, looking angry. "The underwater monsters tried to capture Jenny a few days ago. They're obviously our enemies." Alice's attitude changed quickly when she thought about Jenny. "In that case, we can't possibly go in there," she said. "We don't need to go in," said Charles. "Let's just wait and see what happens." "The doors are all closed," said one of the paranormals in the group that had arrived. "Shall we open them?" There were 12 doors in the water mansion, 3 in each of its 4 walls. Each door had a complicated-looking lock on it. Some of the paranormals tried to open the doors, but they couldn't move them. One of the paranormals used his true fire, but a gleaming flame hit one of the doors, but it made absolutely no impact. More and more paranormals started to attack them from a distance. They tried to destroy the doors with their superpowers, but they had no impact either. "I'll try. Watch this," said a blade-type paranormal. He struck the door with a shaft of white light, but it bounced back off the door and hit him. Caught off guard, the rebounding light caused him terrible injuries. The paranormal's teammates rushed to help him and treated his wounds. Several more paranormals tried the same type of attack, but to no avail. And again, their life blades bounced right back. They were able to avoid being hit, having seen what had happened the first time, so they didn't pick up any injuries. It soon became obvious that they weren't going to be able to get access to the Water Mansion just by using their superpowers. But they became excited by the challenge facing them, thinking that if they could destroy the mansion, it could have no hold over them. As more and more people crowded around the lake, Charles's team tried to make sure they were inconspicuous. Wearing their wolf fur coats, they slowly approached the Water Mansion. "Charles, what are you doing here?" A surprised voice sounded in his ear. "I could ask the same of you," Charles replied. It was Archer, and Charles was just as surprised to see him as he was to see Charles. "I couldn't ignore the call," said Archer. "It came from deep within my soul, and even if it turns out to be a trap, I can never ignore a call from the soul." Charles understood that all too well, and he knew that as a person's strength increased, so did the risk of being attacked in some way. But he wondered if Archer was telling him the truth. They'd only met by chance, and he knew that Archer might well be his enemy too. Dropping his voice, Charles issued him a warning. "If there's something in that mansion that can increase your strength a massive amount, and perhaps even make you invincible, you have to think very carefully how you use the power that invincibility will give you." Archer had faced a difficult choice in Charles's previous life, and it had ended in tragedy. But the Water Mansion had appeared much earlier in Charles's new life than it had in his past one, and Charles didn't know if Archer was the same sort of man that he had been back then. Archer laughed. "If I really had invincible power, the first thing I'd do is kill all the zombies in the world and bring an end to this dreadful apocalypse. After that, I'd be happy and carefree."